In the quiet suburb of Oak Ridge Meadows, 72-year-old Korean War veteran Henry Marshall faced this nightmare when the HOA president yelled, "Get that rusty tank out of here, old man." The tow truck roared in, hauling away Henry's old M47 patent tank, a relic of his wartime days, as if it were nothing more than scrap metal. The entire neighborhood watched in silence as Henry, his hands shaking with suppressed rage, stood still. But what they didn't know was that a military convoy was on the way, and their indifference would soon be drowned out by the roar of justice. Subscribe to the channel today if you want to hear more moving stories of courage and gratitude. Henry Marshall wakes up at 4:30 every morning, a ritual formed during his 25 years in the Army. At 72, his body bears the scars of the Korean War. A bullet hole in his forearm acts like a survival map, and a slight limp from a frostbitten foot slows his steps. Yet his spirit burns with an unshakable fire, a quiet resilience that has carried him through decades of trials. He lives alone in a modest bungalow on the edge of Oak Ridge Meadows, a neighborhood that was once a haven for working-class families. Over the years, it has become a showcase for upscale homes with immaculate lawns, gleaming SUVs, and strict HOA rules that seem to value appearances over people. In his driveway is his pride and joy, a 1952 M47 patent tank, painted a faded olive green, its surfaces weathered by time but meticulously maintained. To outsiders, it might look like a rusted tank, a relic lost in the manicured perfection of Oak Ridge Meadows. But to Henry, it is a masterpiece, a living testament to the battles he fought and the men he lost. Every dent tells a story of survival. A near miss, a crash during a desperate retreat across the frozen hills of Korea. Every scratch whispers memories of his deployment, of nights under starless skies, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Hanging from the turret was a set of dog tags, not his own, but those of his 6 comrades who never returned. Thomas, Daniel, Robert, Isaac, Samuel, and Benjamin. Henry could still hear their voices, their laughter echoing across the years. Thomas's dry humor cutting through the tension before mission. Daniel's silent prayers as they rolled into battle. The tank was more than a vehicle. It was a time capsule, a bridge between past and present, a promise never to be forgotten. Every morning, Henry would walk down the driveway, run his hand along its cold steel, and whisper their names, as if to assure them that they were still with him. The neighborhood might have changed, but Henry's devotion to his tank, and the men it honored, remained unwavering, a silent rebellion against the superficial values that now surrounded him. One crisp Wednesday morning in early May 2025, as Henry sat on his porch sipping black coffee from a chipped mug, the bitter aroma jolting him back to the present, he spotted a group of people approaching his bungalow. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, a stark contrast to the tension building in his chest. Leading the group was HOA President Margaret Steele, her heels clicking loudly on the pavement like a metronome counting down to conflict. Her designer coat flapped in the wind, and she clutched a clipboard like a weapon, her stance commanding. Behind her were 2 tractors, their engines rumbling ominously, and several board members, their faces showing disapproval, some with their arms crossed, others whispering to each other as they eyed Henry's property with judgmental eyes. Margaret stopped at the edge of Henry's driveway, her eyes sweeping over the tank with disdain. She adjusted her scarf, a bright red diagonal against the muted morning, and shouted loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Mr. Marshall, this tank is in violation of Section 9, Section 3. No unsightly or inoperable vehicles are permitted on Oak Ridge Meadows." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife, and Henry felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same tension he felt before a gunfight. He set his cup down carefully, the clink of ceramic against the wooden porch, and stood to face her. His voice was steady even as his hands shook, a tremor that betrayed the storm of emotions he was trying to contain. "Ma'am, this tank runs fine. I started it up last week for a Veterans Day event at the hospital," he said, his words measured but firm. Margaret scoffed, her manicured fingernails tapping the clipboard in an impatient rhythm. "It's an eyesore, Mr. Marshall. We've had complaints," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the neighborhood, her hand running over the neat row of houses as if the houses themselves had spoken out against him. She didn't say who had complained, and Henry suspected there had been no real complaints, just Margaret's obsession with perfection. Her cold, hard eyes behind her designer glasses locked on his. "The board voted last week. You were notified by mail," she continued, her voice dripping with condescension. Henry's brows furrowed. He hadn't received any notice. He'd been out of town visiting a veterans hospital, delivering care packages to men and women who understood the gravity of the service. But Margaret continued, unconcerned with his explanation. "We're going to remove it right now. You'll have to pay $300 for the violation, plus towing and storage fees," she announced, her tone as if she were handing down a death sentence on his most prized possession. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some stood on their porches, shifting uncomfortably as they watched the scene unfold, their expressions both anxious and curious. Others gathered in small groups, whispering to each other, their voices low in the morning silence. A young woman in running gear paused mid-run, her headphones dangling as she stared at the trailers. An old man across the street, leaning on a cane, shook his head but said nothing. No one stepped forward to defend Henry, their silence a weight on him, amplifying his isolation. Across the street, a teenager named Ethan recorded the confrontation on his phone, his expression torn between amusement and guilt. Ethan's grandfather had told him stories of Henry's tank ride in the town's Memorial Day parade when Ethan was just a boy. He remembered climbing into the tank with the other kids, the roar of the tank's engine below, as Henry shared stories of courage and camaraderie. "This tank took us through hell and back," Henry had said, his voice warm with memory. Now, as he watched Margaret's cold refusal, Ethan felt a twinge of guilt for not speaking up, a detail that made the community's silence more personal and relatable, setting up their eventual redemption. "This tank is a piece of history," Henry said, his voice low but firm, each word carrying the weight of decades. "It's not junk." He pointed at the tank, its faded paint catching the morning light, a silent witness to the battles it had survived. Margaret waved dismissively, her rings flashing as she signaled to the tow truck drivers. "Perhaps this will encourage you to clean up this lot. The overgrown lawn and that faded flag are dragging down our property values," she snapped, her voice sharp with contempt. Her words were sharp, each a stab at Henry's pride, but he refused to let her see his pain. The flag she mocked had been raised every morning since he'd moved to Oak Ridge Meadows, a ritual honoring the men he'd lost. The lawn, slightly overgrown, is a testament to the hours he spent volunteering at the VA hospital, never neglecting his duties, but prioritizing those who needed him most. The rickshaw pullers began to chain the tank, the clanging of metal echoing like a death knell on the quiet street. Henry stood still, his calloused hands clenched at his sides, the trembling in his hands increasing as he watched the chains tighten around the tank. Inside, he felt a storm brewing, a mix of anger, grief, and helplessness that threatened to shatter the stoic mask he had worn for decades. The tank was more than a vehicle. It was a promise to the 6 men with military badges who now rattled against the turret as it was pulled, their metal bells a haunting reminder of the lives they had left behind. Margaret handed him a notice, her tone cold and impassive. "You have 30 days to appeal," she said, her eyes glancing at the paper, as if it were a formality. But her gaze, hard and unwavering, told Henry that the decision was final, that an appeal was an empty gesture intended to appease rather than correct. The paper trembled slightly in the space between them, a fragile barrier against the injustice that was being done. As the trailer rumbled away, the engine roaring like a predator claiming its prey, Henry caught the eye of his neighbor, Clara Evans, a single mother who had moved in 6 months earlier. She stood on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if shielding herself from the sight. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and Henry saw the shame etched on her face. Shame for witnessing his humiliation, for not speaking up. She looked away, shoulders hunched as she retreated, unable to bear the weight of his gaze. A whisper rose in the crowd, barely audible over the fading rumble of the trailer. "My daughter would have loved to see that old tank. It's like something out of a war movie." The words came from a middle-aged man, standing at the edge of the group, his voice sad but distant. Another voice chimed in, softer, almost apologetic, "But it doesn't belong here. Not with all these new houses." They didn't understand. To them, the tank was an oddity, a relic out of place in their glittering world. But to Henry, it represented promises made on the frozen hills of Korea, promises sealed with blood and sacrifice, promises to those who died so that others might live. Henry picked up his coffee, now cold, the bitter taste lingering on his tongue as he walked back to his house. His steps were slow, deliberate, each a fight against the grief that threatened to overwhelm him. He paused at the door, glancing back at the empty driveway, the space where the tank had stood for 2 decades. The absence was like a physical wound, a part of his soul torn away by Margaret's unfeeling rules. But Henry's resolve was hardened. He had faced worse than this, survived ambushes and blizzards, and lost his closest friends. He would not let the HOA erase the memory of his men. Inside his house, Henry stood before a faded photograph on the wall. 6 young soldiers, himself included, grinning beside an M47 Patton in a snowy Korean valley, their faces glowing with the reckless hope of youth. The edges of the photo were crooked, the colors faded with time, but the memory was as vivid as ever. Thomas, with his sharp wit, always had a joke ready to lighten the mood. Daniel, the quiet one, would hum hymns under his breath, a steadying presence in the chaos. Robert, Isaac, Samuel, and Benjamin. Each had left an indelible mark on Henry's heart. Their names were etched into his soul, a prayer he said every morning to keep them alive in his memory. He held the HOA notice, its legal jargon spread across the page like a spiderweb, designed to intimidate and confuse. At the bottom was the address of the storage facility where his tank would be kept, locked up like a prisoner, awaiting redemption or auction in 90 days. The thought of it sitting in a cold, lifeless lot, devoid of all meaning, made Henry's heart ache. Through the window, he watched Margaret and her gang move to the next house, clipboards ready to hunt for more violations. Oak Ridge Meadows returned to its sterile perfection, its manicured lawns and polished facade a stark contrast to the chaos in Henry's heart. No one knocked on his door to check on him. No one called to see if he was okay. The neighborhood had moved on, as if his grief were a minor inconvenience, a stain to be erased like his tank. Before settling in Oak Ridge Meadows 20 years ago, Colonel Henry Marshall had been a legend in military circles. He would give you the shirt off your back in a blizzard. Major Tom Ellis, who now lives in another state, recalled, his voice filled with admiration as he spoke of Henry. During the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir in 1950, Henry dragged 3 wounded men to safety under enemy fire, his body a shield against the hail of bullets. He carried them for miles through the snow, his breathing ragged, his limbs screaming in protest, until they reached safety. That night earned him a Bronze Star, but Henry never displayed it, instead keeping it in a small wooden box, buried beneath letters from the families of his fallen comrades. After Korea, Henry joined the Army Corps of Engineers, dedicating his life to rebuilding communities devastated by disaster. He worked during hurricanes in Florida, wading through floodwaters to build emergency shelters, his steady hands hammering nails into makeshift roofs. In Peru, after a devastating earthquake, he helped build bridges connecting isolated villages, his engineering skills a lifeline to people who had lost everything. In Bangladesh, during the floods of the 1980s, he taught locals how to build flood-resistant houses, his patience and kindness winning them over. He taught us that building something that lasts is about honoring those who came before, said Professor Emily Tran, who invited Henry to be a visiting lecturer at her university. In his lecture, Henry spoke not of his own heroic deeds, but of the importance of resilience, of creating works, both physical and spiritual, that can stand the test of time. The tank itself has a history few in Oak Ridge Meadows can appreciate. Henry tracked it down in the 1980s, and after years of searching, discovered it was the exact model his unit had used in Korea. It had been rusting away in a junkyard, its body pitted with age, but Henry saw its potential. He bought it with his own savings and spent years restoring it, sourcing genuine parts from military surplus stores across the country. He replaced the engine, repainted the body its original olive green, and polished every surface until it sparkled. Every Veterans Day, he drove it to the local VA hospital, ferrying older veterans, their eyes lighting up with memories as they ran their hands along its steel. That tank was more than just a vehicle, General David Carter, Henry's former commanding officer, said with emotion. It was a living tribute. Henry visited the families of those 6 men every year, keeping their spirits alive. One family, the Thomases, shared how Henry brought the tank to their home on Daniel's birthday every year. He let us sit inside, close our eyes, and feel Daniel's presence, Mrs. Thomas told a local reporter, her voice trembling with gratitude. It was like he was still with us, walking with Henry. The tank was more than just a machine. It was a vessel of memory, a sacred space where past and present converged. Unbeknownst to the HOA, the tank had been registered as a memorial vehicle by the VA, a status that protected it from being scrapped. Henry had filed the paperwork years ago, after a friend at the VA suggested it, but in the heat of the moment, he couldn't remember where he'd filed the documents. They were somewhere in his cluttered filing cabinet, buried under decades of letters and military records. Uncertainty gnawed at him as he sat on the couch that evening, the house feeling emptier without the tank outside. The delay built suspense, leaving the viewer wondering if Henry had lost his tank forever, heightening the emotional tension as the story unfolded. That evening, Henry sat on the porch, staring at the empty driveway, the space where his tank had stood for 2 decades, now an open wound in the fading light. The air was cool, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine from a neighbor's garden, but Henry felt only the coldness of loss. Clara's 9-year-old son, Lucas, approached timidly, his sneakers scraping against the pavement. "Uncle Marshall, my mom says they shouldn't have taken your tank," he said, his voice small but sincere. Henry smiled softly, the lines on his face deepening with the gesture. "Sometimes, Lucas, people care more about rules than reasons," he replied, his words heavy with the weight of experience. Lucas tilted his head, his brow furrowed. "Will you get it back?" he asked, his eyes wide with hope. Henry glanced at the train tracks on the edge of town, their steel gleaming faintly in the moonlight, and checked his watch. It was 7:32 p.m. on May 14th, 2025, and he knew what was coming. "Some things, once taken, can never be taken back," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But some promises can never be broken." His words hung in the air, a mysterious promise that left Lucas with more questions than answers. But the boy nodded, sensing the gravity of the moment. Henry stood, his joints creaking as he straightened and patted Lucas gently on the shoulder. "Go home, son. Tomorrow is a new day." Lucas hesitated, then turned and ran back to the house, glancing at Henry one last time as he disappeared inside. The next morning, a deep siren broke the silence of dawn in Oak Ridge Meadows, a mournful wail echoing through the streets like a call to arms. It was 5:45 a.m. on May 15th, 2025, and residents shifted in confusion, rubbing the sleep from their eyes as they looked out their windows. A convoy of military vehicles pulled up, stopping at the intersection of Pine Street, the only direct route out of the neighborhood. For camouflage-painted trucks and a command vehicle sat motionless, their engines humming with a low, steady growl. Soldiers in crisp uniforms stood at attention, faces unreadable, rifles slung across their backs. At their center stood General Marcus Tate, a tall, steely-eyed figure, his uniform decorated with ribbons that spoke of a lifetime of service. Traffic quickly came to a standstill as citizens, eager to begin their morning commutes, honked their horns in frustration. A delivery driver leaned out of his window, shouting, "Come on, I have a delivery." A mother in a pickup truck, her children squabbling in the back seat, rolled down her window to plead, "Please, I'm late for work." But the soldiers remained unmoved, their postures rigid, their silence a wall of defiance. Margaret arrived in her gleaming sedan, her face a mask of rage as she stormed toward General Tate, her heels clicking with each determined step. "This is a civilian road. What does this mean?" she demanded, her voice shrill with indignation. "Training exercise, ma'am," Tate replied, his tone calm but firm, his deep voice carrying commanding authority. "We'll be here in 24 hours. There's a detour. It'll add 40 minutes to your travel time." He consulted a clipboard, his movements precise, as if he were staging a battlefield maneuver rather than a neighborhood confrontation. Margaret's face flushed, her hands balled into fists. "This is unacceptable. People have lives, jobs, appointments, responsibilities," she barked, her voice rising with each word. But Tate's expression did not waver. "We apologize for the inconvenience," he said, though his tone suggested he had no remorse. The soldiers behind him stood like statues, their presence a silent rebuke to Margaret's rights. Whispers spread through the growing crowd as Lucas's father, Nathan, stepped forward, his face pale but determined. The night before, after watching the tank being towed away, he had spent hours researching its history online, driven by a nagging sense of guilt for his silence. What he found shocked him. "This is no ordinary tank," Nathan told the crowd, his voice shaking with anger and awe. "It's a VA-registered memorial vehicle, protected under federal law. Taking it is not only cruel, it's illegal." He held up his phone, showing a screenshot of the VA registry, the tank serial number clearly listed. Nathan's revelation spread through the crowd, stirring murmurs of disbelief and shame. He called a friend at the local newspaper, who alerted Fort Grayson, a military base 30 miles away. By midnight, the story had reached General Tate, who wasted no time in organizing the motorcade. At 8 a.m., a column of veterans began to arrive, their arrival signaled by the soft shuffle of boots and the tapping of canes on the pavement. Some limped with the aid of walkers, their faces lined with the lines of age and experience. Others rolled forward in wheelchairs, their uniforms decorated with medals that gleamed in the morning sun. They had lived through conflict from Korea to Iraq, a living timeline of service and sacrifice, and they lined up beside the motorcade in silence, their presence a quiet but powerful rebuke to the HOA's actions. A flatbed truck approached from the other side of the tracks, its engine rumbling as it carried Henry's M47 patent tank, its surface gleaming in the morning sun after a night of restoration by the soldiers at Fort Grayson. An American flag flew from its antenna, the stars and stripes a vivid contrast to the olive-green hull. Behind the wheel sat Henry, now dressed in his full army uniform, his medals shining like stars against the dark fabric. Medals he hadn't worn in years, each a testament to the battles he'd fought and the lives he'd saved. The veterans saluted as Henry stepped off, his movements careful, his eyes scanning the tank with a gentleness that spoke of decades of dedication. He ran a hand along the side of the car, making sure the 6 tags were still hanging inside, their faint jingling a reassurance that his men were still with him. Satisfied, he nodded to Tate, who turned to Margaret and the HOA board, their faces solemn. "This vehicle is protected by federal law as a memorial vehicle designated for fallen service members," Tate said, his voice heavy with authority. "Its removal constitutes the unlawful seizure of military heritage property." He handed Margaret a cease and desist order, crisp and formal, a stark contrast to the shaky notice she'd given Henry the day before. Her confidence crumbled as she realized the crowd, now including reporters with cameras rolling, was watching her downfall, a mirror of Henry's humiliation. Her face flushed, her hands shaking as she clutched the paper, the weight of her mistake weighing heavily on her. Henry started the tank's engine, the roar tearing through the morning air, a resounding rebuttal to the HOA's claim that it was not working. The veterans formed an honor guard, saluting sharply and precisely as Henry drove back to his property, the tank's tracks rattling against the pavement. Their silence was louder than any protest, a testament to the dignity of service and the power of unity. He stopped beside Lucas and Nathan, who were standing in the middle of the crowd, Lucas's eyes wide with amazement. "Want a ride home, young man?" Henry asked, his voice soft but warm. Lucas beamed, climbing into the vehicle with a grin, his small hands gripping the edge of the turret as they rolled through the neighborhood. The convoy's horn sounded again, a deep, resonant note signaling the end of the blockade. The soldiers packed up, clearing enough of the tracks to make a point without causing chaos, their mission accomplished. Back on the driveway, Henry helped Lucas down, the boy's laughter a bright spot in the otherwise heavy morning. He shook Nathan's hand, firm and steady. "Thank you for your service," Nathan said softly, his voice full of emotion. Henry nodded, his eyes distant but kind. "It's not about thanking, it's about remembering." By evening, the story had spread like wildfire. Local news headlined, "Military Convoy Restores Stolen Veterans Memorial." Social media was abuzz with videos of Henry's quiet strength, the tank glistening in the sunlight, the veterans standing united. "This isn't a publicity stunt," General Tate told reporters, his voice even. "This is about making amends for one of our own." The HOA held an emergency meeting the next night, the room packed with residents, every seat taken and many standing along the walls. Margaret began with excuses about a misunderstanding, her voice shaking as she read a prepared statement, but she was interrupted. "My uncle served with Henry," said Paul Carter, a quiet resident who rarely spoke at meetings, his voice rising with anger. "You took a memorial to fallen soldiers for property value. That was not a mistake." Another neighbor, whose daughter was deployed overseas, stood up, his hands shaking. "Is this how we honor our veterans? By erasing their memories because they don't fit our aesthetic?" The meeting moved from damage control to reflection, a collective reckoning that weighed heavily on the room with guilt and resolve. In the end, residents approved waivers for a memorial vehicle, a Veterans Advisory Board, and a planned monument in the community park, a stone monument commemorating those who served. At the local middle school, teacher Laura Bennett turned the incident into a lesson for her students. "What does this teach us about balancing rules with respect for duty?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. A shy student in the back raised her hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "They care more about how things look than what the tank means." The county VA office saw a 400% increase in memorial registrations as people, inspired by Henry's story, sought to secure their own memorials. A few days later, soldiers from Fort Grayson came to Henry's house, their movements quiet and respectful. They installed a bronze plaque in his driveway, engraved simply but poignantly, "Memorial Site in memory of the fallen of Bravo Company, 1950. Before she resigned, Margaret sat alone in her car, the engine off, silence all around her. She stared at a photo of her father, a Vietnam veteran she had never really known, his face smiling back at her from a faded Polaroid. Memories flooded back, his stories of loss, the way he spoke of his fallen comrades, the guilt he carried for having survived when they were no more. She wrote Henry a letter of apology, her hand shaking as she wrote the words, each one a step toward understanding the gravity of her actions. She left the letter on his doorstep, her eyes red as she drove away, her posture straightening, as if a burden had been lifted. Henry declined to be interviewed, accepting his neighbor's apologies cheerfully, his demeanor unchanged despite the attention. Margaret resigned a week later, but not before sending her 15-year-old son, Caleb, to Henry's doorstep. "My mom said I should check out your tank," Caleb said nervously, shifting his feet. Henry watched him for a moment, then nodded, a small smile on his lips. Tomorrow, 6 a.m. The next morning, Henry resumed his usual routine, carefully polishing the tank, the morning dew glistening on its surface. Caleb, Lucas, and the other neighborhood kids joined him, their laughter mingling with the soft clanking of tools as Henry explained the history of the tank, not just a machine, but a vessel of memories. "They don't learn about tanks," Clara noted to Nathan as they sat watching from the porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands. "They learn about honor." Over the weeks, Oak Ridge Meadows has changed. American flags, the porches, their colors vibrant against the autumn hues. Neighbors stop to chat with Henry, no longer rushing past, their smiles genuine when they ask about his day. Veterans in the area feel a newfound respect, their stories sought out instead of ignored. I lived next door to Henry for 10 years and never knew he was a hero, one resident told her sister, her voice tinged with regret. It makes you wonder who else we've overlooked. Henry is still the same, rising at dawn, tending his garden, keeping his fish tank clean. But now, children often gather in his driveway, listening to stories about rebuilding bridges in disaster zones and the value of lasting legacies, their eyes wide with wonder. One cold November day, a young man in military uniform approached Henry's private path, his boots crunching on fallen leaves. "Colonel Marshall," he asked, his posture straightening instinctively. Henry nodded, wiping his hands on a cloth before shaking hands. "I'm Lieutenant Daniel Thomas, Daniel's son," the young man said, his voice calm but full of emotion. Henry's eyes softened, recognition flashing as he looked at the young man, the reflection of the friend he had lost. Daniel was one of 6 men with military badges hanging in the tank. "My father never came home," Daniel said, his voice breaking slightly. "But you kept him alive for us." He paused, swallowing hard. "I'm in the engineer corps, leaving soon. I want to thank you." Henry gestured toward the tank, its body gleaming in the pale sunlight. "Your father always sat on the left, said it had the best view." As Daniel climbed in, Henry handed him his father's dog tags, the metal cool in his palm. "They're yours now. I've carried them long enough." Daniel's voice broke as he clutched the tags, tears welling in his eyes. "But your promise," Henry interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "Some promises need new keepers." They sat in silence, the weight of history between them, the tank a silent witness to their shared grief and gratitude. Daniel told of how his mother kept a box of his father's letters, reading them on each of his birthdays. Sitting in the tank, he felt his father's presence for the first time, a moment that deepened the emotional bond between generations. The neighbors gathered, sensing the gravity of the moment. Their faces darkened as Daniel greeted Henry, a gesture of respect that Henry dutifully returned. Lucas, watching from his porch, asked, "Who was that?" Henry smiled, his eyes distant. Next chapter. That evening, Henry sat on the porch, the flag by the door glowing in the sunset, its colors glowing against the amber sky. The empty chair beside him seemed to hold the souls of his fallen comrades, an invisible presence that never left him. A journalist once asked him why he still remembered them after all these years. Henry's answer never changed. "I don't need to be remembered. I just need them to be remembered." Henry's story reminds us that true heroism isn't about big words. It's about the quiet determination to keep a promise, no matter the cost. His M47 patent tank, a bridge between past and present, taught Oak Ridge Meadows to appreciate the sacrifices behind scars. It's a lesson in courage, forgiveness, and the power of remembrance, a call to look beyond appearances and into the stories that shape us. Veterans like Henry don't just defend our freedom, they defend our values, ensuring that those who have fallen are never forgotten. What would you do if someone took away your most sacred memories, all in the name of trivial rules? Do you know a veteran whose quiet power changed your perspective? Or witnessed a moment of injustice met with justice? Take a moment to reflect on their impact. Perhaps call a veteran you know, thank them, or share their story in the comments below. Let's honor those who served by preserving their legacy, just as Henry did. As autumn settled over Oak Ridge Meadows, the community park unveiled a stone monument for those who served and those who waited. Henry's daily rhythms, rising with the sun, tending the fish tank, sharing wisdom with children, became the foundation of the neighborhood's new identity. At City Hall, Mayor Jessica Lane proposed an annual day of remembrance, not to rehash the past, but to ensure that the history that lives among us is never forgotten again. Henry's journey shows us that the greatest victories are won with honor, not anger, a truth that resonates far beyond the small town. If Henry's unwavering pride touched you, if you felt a lump in your throat when he got his tank back, don't let this story end here. Subscribe to Daily Narrated Stories now and join us as we share stories that change lives, inspire, uplift, and remind us of what really matters. Share this video with those who need to hear it, and together we can build a community that celebrates heroes. Don't wait. Time flies, and every story counts. At Daily Narrated Stories, we believe in the power of stories to heal, connect, and inspire. Henry's story is just one of many, and with your help, we will continue to bring them to light. Some battles are won without a shot being fired, just a heart that refuses to forget.